So I'd love to introduce Ghazi Ahamat. He is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, and he is going to be the moderator and the presenter for this. Just a few notes before I hand over entirely. You can send questions to Ghazi and the rest of the panelists by this little kind of sidebar. So click on Q&A and those will come through to us, and also do chat to other people. So, but without further ado, I will pass over to Ghazi, who I can already see is ready and waiting. Really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. And thank you all, and welcome to this conversation on assuring data and AI. As Alice said, I'm Ghazi Ahamat. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the CDI, where I lead our work on AI assurance, and was also part of the team that authored our review into bias and algorithmic decision-making last year. As we've been hearing throughout the many conversations in CogX and also elsewhere, we're becoming increasingly aware that AI and other data-driven technologies have the potential to unlock really significant benefits for society across many sectors, from the convenience we take for granted in our smartphones and web applications to fundamental breakthroughs in medicine and science. However, these technologies also bring significant risks, most obviously around issues like privacy in our personal data, but also the potential for bias and discrimination, or new risks to our safety or security. One big underlying challenge is that for both data and AI to be trusted, it requires that those who develop, use, and are affected by these technologies have meaningful and reliable information about how these technologies are made and used. We call this the problem of assurance. Assurance covers a number of governance mechanisms that allow third parties to develop trust in the compliance and risk of a system or organization. Originally developed from the accounting profession, there's already a range of assurance techniques that have emerged in other contexts, and they cover things like audits, certification, or impact assessments. We've also seen a number of efforts to develop assurance methods, such as audits in both data and AI. However, these efforts have been quite fragmented and have had mixed success. Today, to discuss these challenges, we are joined by Zimeta and Maria Axente. Zimeta is Head of Public Policy at the Open Data Institute. She previously led work on data and policy at the Royal Society, the Alan Turing Institute, and the Medical Research Council. She holds degrees in philosophy from Oxford, Cambridge, and York. Maria Axente leads PwC's work on responsible AI and AI for good, where she advises industry, academia, governments, and more on how to address the power of AI in an ethical and responsible manner. She's also very active in AI policy and AI standards, whether at the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI, Tech UK's Data and AI Committee, or standards committees at the British Standards Institution and the IEEE. Welcome to you both. There's a lot of ground we could cover in this conversation. I want to start with you, Maria. Why do you think that AI assurance is important in the broader context of AI governance and responsible AI?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. Delighted to say hello from King's Cross. And although this is a virtual event, I made my way on site because how else would you celebrate CogX, the biggest festival of AI? And the question you're posing, Ghazi, is probably the most interesting to start. Why do we need quality assurance? Wouldn't we want to make sure that the artifacts in the computer science and software development have the same standards of quality as we do with everything else, right? We quality assure our cars, our trains, our buildings to make sure that they comply with certain standards. They are fit for purpose. We prevent accidents, and they are there to be used for a long period of time. So if we have developed this discipline of assuring the quality for a lot of the artifacts we build around us, we need to apply the same thoroughness in the software development world. And to a certain extent, the quality assurance in software development has been there for a long time. But the increased adoption, development and use of AI points a few challenges. And I want to talk a little bit about those challenges and why quality assurance in the world of AI is paramount. First of all, we're talking about a stochastic artifact that we're building, whereas the processes that surround and governs the build and use of AI are deterministic in nature. The second big challenge that we have when it comes to AI is that AI display its own agency, interacts with this external environment, adapts to it, and has a certain degree of autonomy. Hence, a new way of thinking of how do we use this artifacts is needed. And lastly, probably the most important one, where we need to accelerate the quality assurance of AI, is the fact that we are dealing with technology that has a profound impact, not only at the individual level, society, but a planetary level. And while we're still scrabbling to govern it with local and even national and potentially supranational tools, we need to pay more attention, not just how well we build it, but keep an eye on when we use it, how well we use it.
Thank you. And just picking up on that, I think there's a really powerful potential for assurance to support sort of regulatory efforts by different governments, as well as support industry to understand what they're buying and what they're using. It's not necessarily that these are alternatives to regulation or self-regulation.
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you for that. Millie, turning to you, while many of the conversations of this week are obviously about AI, a really important characteristic of AI is, particularly the machine learning side of AI, is that it relies on data. And trustworthy data is obviously increasingly important more generally in society. What do you think it means to build trust and trustworthiness in data and its use?
So that's a great question, Ghazi. Thank you very much. And also thank you for the invitation to be here today at CogX. It's a real honor. So in terms of building kind of trust and trustworthiness in data use, at the Open Data Institute, the ODI where I work, we call this data assurance. And it's a process that provides confidence that data will meet a specific need. So it's got to be kind of quite purposeful in that way. And that organizations collecting, using and sharing data are doing so in trustworthy ways. And it's really important to consider both sides of the equation, both the organizations providing or sharing the data and the organizations collecting or using it. And I'll give you two thought experiments. So from the perspective of the data provider, kind of providing data is a bit like sending your child to a new school and thinking about what you'd want to know about the school before you decide to send your child there. So that's a bit like what it's like when you're providing data to another organization to use. What are they going to do with it? And then thinking about it from the perspective of the data reusers, sort of like acquiring data, that's a bit like buying a second-hand car and thinking, has this been modified? What's the record for this car? So it's, but data assurance provides that transparency and trust in both directions. I think it's worth saying that trust has a kind of a relational aspect, which is kind of, outwardly facing, and I suppose an internal aspect, which is kind of, inward facing. So the relational aspect of trust, which is being trusted by others, that's very context sensitive. It depends on the use case. It depends on the sector. It depends on, what else is happening at that time, the narrative. It depends on your history and so on. So that's a relational, and it can be quite dynamic and context sensitive. The other aspect of trust is trustworthiness, which is internal, which is about you holding yourself accountable or taking measures to ensure kind of integrity, that, as Maria said, the discipline of assurance internally. And that's around governance frameworks, checks and balances, and also skills and training, competence not to be overlooked. So there's sort of different aspects of it, thinking about it, not just in terms of data for algorithmic use, but data for other uses too.
Thank you, Millie. I like that you've raised the common framework of trust and trustworthiness. I found Baroness Nora O'Neill's work in this space to be really influential. And it's interesting the way that you distinguish trustworthiness is about yourself or about the organization itself. And that's sort of an important starting point, but it's not enough. It's not just enough that what you're doing is trustworthy. Others need to have good reason to trust you. And these assurance tools are a really important sort of communication device. One challenge that raises is translation, because what information you might need as a developer to know whether you can trust this system might be way more complex or in a totally different, or caring about totally different things than what the end user might care about in knowing whether they should trust the use of that algorithm. So thank you for bringing these really useful frameworks for thinking about the problem. I wanted to think about where do we think the problem of assurance is most urgent, and where do we think there's a most compelling need, or where we should be focusing on first. Maria, I might start with you again. Where do you think AI assurance is most urgent?
That's an excellent question, and I would say everywhere. We need to make quality assurance of AI part of the BAU, the business as usual, the standard processes we go about to build AI and we use AI. If we don't do this at this point in time, we might focus too much on high-risk application, for example, where we've seen the European Commission with their new AI Act drafting conformity assessment, the need to perform conformity assessment for high risk application. But the reality is we need to perform quality assurance across the life cycle for all the AI application we're building with a certain degree of thoroughness and certain degree of sophistications of the tool we might be using. And in order to do this, you need to be having some prerequisites built in already, like impact assessment and the fact that we need to consider how all the stakeholders, not just those directly impacted by the AI application, will receive that application on long term, carry on human rights assessment, but also equally risk assessment. Very importantly is that we need to distill the discipline of documentation among data scientists and engineers to be able to have that transparency in the process and understand how decisions have been made, who's responsible, and also very importantly, how to be able to mitigate when things can go wrong. And ultimately, another prerequisite that's important for quality assurance is clear governance. We have talked so much about governance, focusing probably a little bit too much on operationalizing ethics, but ultimately governance is about having clarity of who's responsible of what, and where certain boundaries of responsibilities are ending and new ones emerge. How do we enact new governance models that will recognize those key characteristics of AI, the fact that we are talking about self-agency, profound impact, and we require to rethink how we stay in control of the AI we build. So yes, I would say everywhere. Let's start consider this an important part of the way we build, deploy, and use AI in order then to be deciding where do we want to focus a bit more attention, for example, for the high risk application, but do not lose the eyes from the ball. Quality assurance is essential if we want AI to work for us.
Thank you, Maria. I might just draw a couple of threads from that where you say, for example, the EU focuses on high-risk users of technology from the perspective of a mandatory conformity assessment, that is an assurance mechanism. That's not to say that assurance methods such as impact assessments won't be really helpful, really important for making sure that the people who are responsible for using these lower risk, but still in some cases quite significant technologies, but they may not be providing that assurance to government. They may be providing assurance to their end users. The other distinction I wanted to draw out is between risk assessment and impact assessment. There's quite a lot of sort of discussion about this. The way I started to see this is risk assessment is quite an subjective or internal. It's risk to you or risk to you as the organization that's maybe deploying these technologies. Impact assessment thinks wider. And I think it's important to do both because otherwise, if you just take a risk impact approach, you might only care about impact on society insofar as it creates reputational or compliance damage, when it's quite important to think about that at the right stage in the process anyway.
Of course. Of course, that's a very helpful clarification, and you're absolutely right to say that at an application level, we see the emergence of stakeholder impact assessment and risk assessment that are more and more part of the development process. But what's really interesting is to see that the governments talk about those impact assessment for the application that are being used in the public sector. So you have the AI impact assessment bill by the Canadian government as a very good example. But also increasingly the Australian government has been talking and promoting the human rights impact assessment. And that sends a very clear message, as you just said, that it's important to go beyond the boundaries of responsibility at organizational level and consider what can be called as extended responsibility. Where do we start looking at societal problem that where we have collective responsibility for those issues and being able to solve it as a collective rather than individual.
Great, thank you, Maria. Turning to you, Millie, wondering where you're seeing the issues of data assurance being most urgent, or where there's a most clear case that we need to be focusing effort.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just reflecting on Maria's comment there about kind of collective responsibility. I guess in terms of urgency, I would say it's maybe how we think about data governance. So I think that, there's a lot of emphasis on having strong internal data governance, to kind of oversee how data is used. But having robust data governance doesn't have to be the same thing as bureaucracy and slowness and kind of, putting the brakes on things. Ultimately, I think the purpose of data governance is to make sure that data is used effectively and well. And so if your data governance is actually going to slow you down or stop you from using data effectively, for example, for the social good, then is that the right level of checks and balances, or and so on. And I guess one way of thinking about it is, some people argue that data stewardship, data governance, it's not that kind of maybe defensive position of data protection, but it's actually an obligation to make sure that data is used effectively and well. And I think that's quite a key shift in mindset. But I think once it happens, it could unlock so many other things which otherwise would get slowed down in process and bureaucracy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to pick up, this increasing narrative of data stewardship as opposed to just data protection. And that sort of data stewardship or governance also means a responsibility to think about unlocking the benefits and not just focusing on the downside risks. I think that is true of both AI and data, but it's interesting to see that narrative pick up in the data language. The other thing I just wanted to highlight there, which you've both been talking about, is this is not just about assurance of the artifact. We're not just talking about assurance of the algorithm or assurance of the data. Quite often we're talking about assurance around the development process or assurance about how these things are used. And I think taking that attitude is a really important distinction as well, because there may be limits to how much we can assure these artifacts when they're constantly evolving. Like it may be that we put the work into getting the assurance at the standard processes and responsible governance level. Not that it's ideally both, but there may be some choices we have to make. I'd like to turn to moving from the sort of urgency to maybe the recent developments. And Amelia, I might start with you. What have you been seeing as the main developments in data assurance?
Yeah, thanks. And I also just wanted to pick up on your last comment, Ghazi, about data assurance. I don't think assurance is a kind of one-time thing that once you've got it forever. So it's by use case as well, and by kind of periods in time and so on. And I think so. To come to the question you're asking now about the kind of developments, I think one thing that we're seeing now is the importance of public or society or consumer acceptance of how data is being used. So it's not enough to kind of be legally compliant. Trust and trustworthiness also depend on public or consumer acceptance of how that data is being used. So again, that's that's not kind of granted for all time. It's contextual. It can be kind of loaned and then taken away again depending on the intention and the use case. Related, I think that what we're seeing a lot more of is openness about data collection, about data processing, but also about the known limitations of the data. And I think that's really important because in in an ideal world, would have perfect data, complete and representative data at all times. But until we get there, maybe we work with the data we've got, but acknowledge its limitations and factor in and be able to discuss the risks around that. So that's, I think, a really important development.
Absolutely. And I think an interesting relationship there is to sort of standards making in the sense of common language, that we all know that the data is always imperfect, but how do we have a common language about how good it is, in what ways it's flawed, so that we understand what might be appropriate and inappropriate uses. And one challenge we've seen to date, but it is starting to get better, is that often the people who are involved in the collection of this data might almost speak a different language in terms of like technical specialty to the people who end up using it, and making sure that as data is an increasing part of the economy through reuse, that we are speaking the same language about these limitations. Maria, I might turn to you. You did speak about some of these topics in terms of AI auditing and the like at the last CogX conference. And I'm wondering, in the past year, what have you been seeing as the developments in AI assurance? And as a result, do you think you're more concerned or more hopeful about the potential of sort of governing AI?
It's true. People who know me, I know that I'm an incurable optimist. So I'll start by saying that I'm definitely an optimist. Things are going in the right direction. But also what I've seen in the last year, since we had the session at CogX with Luciano Floridi, Virginia Dignuman, Rubens Beans, discussing about the case of quality assurance in AI, how much things have evolved. First of all, the work you guys are doing through the Center for Data Ethics of Innovation. Hoo-ha, let's celebrate that, because you're doing exactly what was needed, the correct framing of what AI assurance is and what's the need for it, what are the stakeholders and who should be involved in it. That did not exist a year ago. We had initial and conceptual definition of what it is, but not something that brings it all together. So very excited to see this work that you guys are doing, and I'll encourage everyone who's interested in the topic to contribute to the work that Ghazi and the team are doing. The second thing that we have seen in the last year is an increased awareness of the topic. As among those who are not necessarily in the public policy space or in the external engagement. So we've been running a research last year on responsible AI to understand where are our clients' minds when it comes of responsible and ethical AI, how well prepared they are for adoption of AI, what sort of measures they take around governance and risk and embedding ethics. And we were pleased to hear that more and more executives in AI are considering the ethics of AI by developing various initiatives, from principles, frameworks to internal policies and boards, but also having AI risk part of a standalone part of the AI strategy that tells quite a lot about that mind shift change that has happened in the last year alone, in between positioning something AI as merely beneficial versus considering the less positive implication and impact of AI. And that's, to me, it's probably my main reason for optimism, to see that the industry is speaking up on it. And hand in hand with preparing this ground for a more robust governance of AI, we could see the interest of quality assurance bubbling on the side. So much so that obviously before the last year, we've seen a lot of interest from technology companies building plug and play solutions in testing bias, explainability, robustness, and security is pretty much the responsible AI toolkit that we have developed as well, only to realize that we're not quite there yet. And I spoke quite recently with Cathy O'Neill, and she said that probably we're somewhere 5 years before we are able to plug and play this type of ready-made solution. The first thing we need to be doing is start assessing the context and how those problems have been formulated. And if you are a fan of her works and you've read her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, you have seen how applying the principles of quality assurance, and she has discovered that this urgent need to reconsider how we develop algorithms in a certain context, who is involved, what sort of objectives, what sort of politics we have attached to it, and how to go about it in a way that reflects of this profound impact on people's life. So yes, I'm optimistic, and remain to be seen how quickly the quality assurance will be picked up as a strategic practice in the development of AI, and make it, demonstrate that the benefits of carrying quality assurance go beyond increasing bureaucracy. And I really love what Millie was saying, is like, we need to start thinking that this is not just yet another bureaucratic exercise, just another compliance exercise. It helps us ensure achieving those ethical and responsible outcomes with AI we all want so much. So if we want to get there, let's incorporate a little bit more hassle and complexity in order to get that result that we all want so much.
Thank you, Maria. I agree with that in terms of the rising awareness. Where I'm maybe a bit more skeptical, kind of in principle, is how, and definitely it's an open debate, is how far could these things really be industrialized or standardized? And the reason I say that is AI is so general purpose that it might be really difficult to come to a sort of general assessment about whether something is fair or whether something is safe. We might be able to develop, and I think we could be able to develop that in particular contexts. But I think there's still always going to be a role for judgment about what level of how fair is fair and how safe is safe. Where I think we are making progress is coming to sort of common language, increasingly common measurement techniques. And I agree with you, that's good cause for optimism. But I think
that's very important. You're absolutely right. It's very, very important to consider the context and not aim for ultimate standardization. But I think the signals we pick up from the industry is to say that we have heard all the debates that you have had. We have consulted the policy work, so we are making all those contextual consideration about how should we go about measuring quality. And I think there's one thing that remains to be debated in the next year is like when and where we start moving towards a formal audit. But that's probably for another at least an hour of conversation.
Absolutely, thank you. Then turning to you, Millie, on data assurance, I think there's been less sort of the same sort of like I guess public outrage around sort of the risks of AI that we've seen. I think there's it's sort of a little bit less visible, some of these issues in the data world, at least from an industry perspective. I'm keen for your thoughts on where we think things are currently developing and where we think there are maybe some big opportunities.
I mean, I'd agree with you that, that there's been less public outcry in the same way that there has around data, in the same way that there has been around AI assurance. But I'd also suggest that maybe it's because there's less public awareness of what data can and can't do. And so, for example, there's huge consumer interest in kind of mitigating climate change. There's huge consumer interest around kind of ethical supply chains. But maybe what hasn't yet been widely understood is the role of data assurance in exactly that, right? In kind of addressing those risks. So there's this category of data called ESG data, environmental, social, and governance data. And if that was standardized, then it would be easier for organizations to assure themselves that they're investing in the right areas. It would be easier for consumers to demand and get transparency to inform their product choices. So that's an area where, you're talking earlier, Ghazi, about kind of standards in kind of AI assurance. That's, standards in ESG data assurance would be brilliant, have a huge impact on consumers and, for civilians too. It's just that there isn't as much public awareness of it. So at the moment, the kind of standards are kind of emerging bottom up and kind of, in a grassroots ad hoc kind of way. If they were standardized across sectors, across jurisdictions, across different kinds of organizations, so private sector, public sector, civil society, that would allow much more transparency, accountability, and easier data sharing and analysis globally across sectors and so on. That would be a game changer.
Great, thank you. And I think the interesting meta thing is assurance is about information. and therefore data assurance is data about data. Often involves data about data, and so thinking about not just the core data that we're using, but what sort of information do we need about the data that is used. And so data is also a big enabler of assurance of other sorts, so such as ESG. The analogy I like to use about the ability of standardization is we have, and I draw on accounting because it's kind of where a lot of this stuff was developed centuries ago, but we have accounting standards, but we don't have standards about how profitable is okay or not. That is, up for the market and also up for decision makers. We do have some minimum standards, such as insolvency, the very, very basics of it, but you're hoping that no one's really worrying about that. Like, you should be working well away from that. And therefore, how much is good enough is not really a question of standards. But, you do need some standards. Okay. I might just turn to the theme of this year's COGEX, which is how do we get the next 10 years right? So we've been sort of focused on the recent past and the current state. But in that sort of time horizon, thinking about a decade from now, what do you think will be the main challenges and the main opportunities in data assurance and AI assurance? Millie, I might start with you and data assurance.
Thanks, Ghazi, and I hope I'm as much of an optimist as Maria is. So my ask would be to policymakers, of course, because I'm a policy nerd, but I guess there's sort of three main asks, and that would be help organizations get ready to adapt. One is around use cases, so finding ways to provide data assurance around new uses of data. So AI is a new use of data, we weren't ready for it. There's going to be other new uses of data on the way, so help organizations be ready to adapt to new uses of data. The second is new markets, right? So prepare for international competition in this area and prepare for others being able at adapting to new markets that arise from the new uses of data. So that's the second area that I think if policymakers could help with would be fantastic. The third is the new players in the game. Find ways to support newer actors in the data ecosystem. New uses of data, new data flows, new markets will mean new organizations joining in, whether that's private sector, whether that's public sector, whether that's civil society, and support them so we get a balanced and dynamic data ecosystem for the good of both civilians and consumers, but also for business.
Thank you, Millie. I think that would be a very exciting future to be a part of. Maria, I wanted to turn to you about the future of AI assurance and what do you think will be the challenges and the opportunities there?
The optimist in me will like to start with the opportunities, obviously, and when we will have the new domain knowledge of AI assurance a bit more mature than what we have it at the moment, I think we will finally found the one tool to help us validate how well we do AI. Right? We've been talking so much, Alice and so many wonderful people in the field of AI ethics of being able to embed and operationalize ethical principles in the world of AI, but we don't have a tool to be able to tell us how well we have been doing. Well, quality assurance of AI will be one of those saving graces that not only that will keep us honest about how well we embed our morality, the right morality in the smart machines, but will be able to give us the chance to correct the wrongs and to address the unintended consequences. But with that comes also the challenge, the fact that no matter how good those tools are, if you not foster a right behavior where people are incentivized in the right way to use quality assurance tools or any other tools to proper govern AI, you will end up having yet another set of tools that could be played to serve any political and organizational purpose and not achieve the higher goals of achieving beneficial and responsible and ethical AI. And until we figure it out how to perform formal audit, it will be very difficult to hold companies accountable, especially those who develop applications in the public domain that will impact millions of lives. And it's very important to push for progress, not only on the policy field, but also in the regulation, so that we can have a bit more teeth for more formal forms of audit of AI. But ultimately, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the topic is that finally we can close the circle, right? We started so well by operationalizing ethics of AI in different ways, from principles to boards to processes and trainings and experts. Audit will allow us to close that loop and validate how well we're doing. And if we are honest in using those tools, it's only going to mean that the next 10 years AI will be built in a right way and we'll have more control over it and its outcomes.
Thank you, Maria. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the language of tools there, because I think this is one of those words that I feel like I'm constantly translating, because by tools, I think ML engineers mean a TensorFlow package that spits out all of the answers that they need. Whereas other people, like executives who are accountable for whether these are fit for purpose, are probably talking about tools that are quite a different sort. And I'm wondering, so maybe like standard lists of questions or common definitions of success. I'm curious as to where you think we're going to get to in terms of, is this something that we're going to be able to automate away and have a single tool or a family of tools that are packages that ML engineers put in and is all fine? Or it sounds like you're more talking about a toolkit for a new profession of people who have the right frameworks and questions to be able to exercise some judgment about whether these things are fit for purpose.
Look, obviously we would want to automate a lot of this task on medium term, but we're not there yet, and we're not going to be there at least for the next 10 years. Let's not just jump into automation before we actually are 100% or we have a high degree of confidence of what we're trying to automate. When I say tools, I mean different artifacts that you use to achieve certain objectives. I'm not necessarily talking about software or code-based tools. There have been plenty developed, as I mentioned earlier, to test bias, for examples. I think that those would be useful, and I think now let's allow ourselves to experiment with that. But if I were to pick up what Cathy O'Neill said, let's try to assess and assure for the context of developing and assuring AI, and see whatever tools we have at the moment and how to best use it to make sure that we supervise what is being delivered, deployed, and the quality of that product as it evolves over time. Automation, yes, it's something on the horizon, but I will stay clear, at least for the next few years, of developing new tools for machine learning engineers. I think there's a lot of work for the policymakers and the regulators before we can start thinking about standardization in this field. But hey ho, I'm not a computer scientist, so obviously they might be disagreeing with me. But from a organizational perspective, I think there's quite a few things that we need to be thinking before we start automating.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I'm afraid we're out of time, but I really wanted to say thank you for this really fascinating conversation and look forward to continuing the conversation.